when I think about women's sexuality and sort of the stereotypical way that women get represented in the media, and like I saw a post once, and maybe you saw this too, Ash, where they showed all of the movies made across time, and the posters that they used to tell the movies, that it was like tons of women's body parts, but not the whole woman, and usually her legs, like from her feet up to her waist. A lot of images like that with her legs spread apart or something like that, like tons of very sexualized messages. What impact do you think that has on women's ideas of themselves and how they should behave sexually?
I think it has a huge impact on women, to be objectified in terms of our bodies, and to be sexualized in terms of our bodies. And I think it's really interesting, because I think sex is something that we're always talking about, but very rarely talking about at any level of depth and connection. And I think that's a really important distinction to make, because there's a difference between talking about sex in a very disconnected and heady way, and in a way that maybe gives rise to that kind of over sexualization or objectification of women's bodies, compared to having a conversation that is connected to what does this bring up within me internally. So I think that is huge, and there's data to show that even very young girls are concerned about how their bodies will be perceived predominantly by men. Will they think, even in early sexual experiences, what will, and as I said, predominantly this data and this research has been done within heterosexual couples, but what will these boys think about their bodies? And I think we really need to look at that, and you will see that, and you'll even if you look at in the media and in terms of movies, the questions that are asked of women are fundamentally different to the questions that are asked of men as well. And we often hear a lot more commentary in terms of what women look like, what they're wearing, their body type, their weight, attractiveness, compared to when we look at men, there can be a lot more talk about intellect or strength or hobbies and that. And I think we really do need to look at that, because that's going to have such an impact in terms of how women view themselves and how they connect to themselves as sexual beings. And as sexual beings, are they there purely just to meet the needs of others, or are they there to really connect with what being a sexual being means for them themselves?
That's so interesting, as I think about this as a woman's issue, clearly, as you're talking about it, it's a people's issue.
Of course.
Right? Like men, I think about men and the people who identify as male, like how do we get them into this sort of circle of recognition? Sometimes I feel kind of helpless about it in some ways. I don't know if you've given much thought to this, but do you have ideas about how to sort of, bring that process along?
And I think, I often feel this, I don't know what the correct word is within me, but it's almost like this debate within me, because I think we do need to have women's conversations, because it's, women have had a public voice in it's such recent history. I'm not sure what it's like in the States, but certainly in Ireland, it's not that far back that when women, got married, they weren't allowed to work, or then they were allowed to get married, but once they had children, they weren't allowed to work, and that's, within kind of grandparents. That's a fairly recent piece. So I think that there are key contextual pieces to being a woman. Yet I think sometimes there can be this frame of opposition where I'm not sure how helpful that is if it's seen as being a fight or a debate in that way. So I think all of these pieces are people's issues, because it doesn't just affect one person or one gender. It affects women, it affects men, it affects transgender people, it affects everybody across the spectrum. And I think that we really need to look at how can we have these open conversations without being overly blaming, because the minute that somebody feels blame, the defenses are going to go up. And I think it comes across here, and I even just say it with clients that it's nothing to do with gender, is the minute that somebody feels attacked, they're going to put up the shield and they're going to have that weapon kind of put back on you. So I think we need to be careful about how we're having these conversations. And I think one of the most important things is to do perspective taking in terms of, how would I feel if I was a cis male hearing this conversation? Would this encourage me to be more open and to check in more, or would it lead to me feeling more defensive? And perhaps then actually, if we get defensive, then kind of not listening to the conversation or not taking this information on board. I don't know if that fits with your perspective, Robyn.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have had that same experience, right? As soon as you start to talk about it in ways where, you do this, then it, like, you want to talk about what's happening, and you want to be able to talk about the behaviors. But I think that I do see that sort of, and I always see it in lots of levels these days, not just at the level of sexuality, but, levels about political differences and,
Absolutely.
yeah, where those defenses go up.
I think that any of these issues that look at kind of human rights issues, for lack of a better word, I think they affect everybody. And as you know, I also identify as a sexual minority. I'm in a same-sex relationship. I have a wife, and one of my favorite movies was the movie Pride. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's based on a true story. If you haven't checked it out, please do. And
Did you say the name of it again?
Pride, Pride.
Yeah,
So kind of like,
I have. Yeah.
have you seen it?
No, I haven't, but I
I
will.
would really recommend checking it out. And it's based over in the UK in the Thatcher era. And it was lesbians and gays helped the miners. And it was when the miners were having a really tough time in the Thatcher regime. And, they were going to lose their livelihood, and everything. And then these group of sexual minorities went and they rallied together to help the miners. And I think that the more that we see our commonality, that's when real change can happen. So whenever I see anything, if it's to do with ethnic minorities, if it's to do with sexual minorities or gender minorities, I try to see that part within myself. And I think that if we're just looking, we're like, that doesn't affect me. And for example, recently we had a referendum in Ireland around women's reproductive rights, which thankfully now we do have the reproductive rights that are in most first world countries. But someone here was saying, well, I don't think that affects me because I would never have a termination or that. And I think it's around how can we connect to, if I was in need, or how does this affect other people, and how can we find those areas of commonality and connection?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. And sometimes it's hard work to find that commonality, but I do think it's there.
Absolutely. And I think that's the piece. It might not come automatically, yet maybe this is a piece where we really need to kind of ground ourselves in our breath and ground ourselves in terms of our intention. Because again, if we're looking at it from a functional contextualist perspective, no matter if we're saying things, and even if they're relevant things, if we're saying it in a way that people cannot listen or cannot hear, it's not going to have the impact that we want. And we're just going to get into a shame cycle. And we know it's really clear from a psychological vantage point. If people get into a shame cycle, they repeat the same behaviors again and again and again. And whether that's in relation to how we respond to other people sexually or how we respond to ourselves, we need to find a more compassionate way of relating. And I think we need to be aware that context shapes everyone. It's not just women. It's not just men. It's not just transgender people. It affects us all. And whenever we go into these places of inequality, or any person is being treated unfairly, that is going to affect everybody in some adverse way.
Yeah, no, I think that's brilliant and something we really need to keep our eye toward.